So I wanted to also thank the Joes for organizing this. It's my first in-person conference since COVID. It's just really nice to be in an actual room with other people. It's been about 10 years since I've worked on Twain. And so when I set out to write this, I thought I was going to do it on corruption and reform, and I didn't get to the reform part, so I'll just say that. but Twain didn't like reformers that much, so I think I'm fine. All right, so Citizens United v. FEC, the 2010 Supreme Court case that opened up elections to corporate spending, very narrowly defines corruption in a way that anyone who has followed national politics over the last decade will immediately recognize. Corruption, according to Justice Kennedy, is a form of individual criminality, and more specifically, a, quote, financial quid pro quo, dollars for political favors. It is an illegal financial transaction, an agreed upon exchange of one kind of thing, money or something of value, for another, a political favor or an administrative act. Not only is this narrow form of corruption difficult to prove and prosecute, but it also includes the many other ways that corruption has been figured as, and continues to be, a central threat to the Republic. In fact, the long 19th century has recently become an important resource for legal scholars and political scientists who have put forward what they refer to as an institutional theory of corruption, one that defines corruption as an institutional form rather than an individual crime. Addressing the failures of an institutional form required different conceptions of corruption than our current focus on criminality, and in what follows, I turn to Twain's writings to outline his more systemic understanding of this term. Twain's co-authored novel, The Gilded Age, is, unsurprisingly, an important source text for considering 19th century corruption. The novel interests me not only because it became known as one of the earliest and most vocal satires on postbellum political graft, but also because it rarely figures such corruption as a set of criminal acts. Instead, the major turns of the plot involve well-meaning characters who seek to manipulate the speculative orientation of the state. The Gilded Age is also a novel in which the West plays an important role. Published a few years after Roughing It, much of the novel is set in a Missouri that Twain depicts as a frontier setting, and one marked by many of the same themes of land and resource speculation that one finds in Roughing It. Thus, for the purposes of this paper, I would like to explore how the West operates as a setting that yokes together institutions and future-oriented speculation. This confluence of governance and speculation, I argue, came out of Twain's experiences in Nevada and can be found in Roughing It. It also lays the groundwork for how corruption operates in The Gilded Age, a novel that depicts corruption as a manipulation of a speculative enterprise, not through quid pro quo exchanges, but through acts of misrepresentation and the distortion of expertise. While my focus will primarily be on the role that Twain's West played in developing his conception of corruption, I'll end this paper by situating Twain's insights in relation to recent work by legal scholars on our contemporary history of corruption. To figure the West through institutions and their practices of bureaucratic management is perhaps counterintuitive, given depictions of the frontier as lawless and free from institutional constraints in 19th century popular culture. Western writing is not usually associated with the expression of institutional norms. For example, Max Westbrook, one of the first critics to take the Western seriously as a subgenre of Western writing, defines the Western according to its opposition to institutions and institutional forms of knowledge. Twain certainly deployed these conventions in his work, figuring the West through his expectations of adventure in the opening chapter of Roughing It, and often highlighting stories of lawless violence. But while the territorial government is described in Roughing It as, quote, newborn and in its, quote, infancy, it is also described in a fair amount of detail. And throughout the work, there's an almost surprising fascination with the workings of organizations and bureaucracies. For example, in addition to the nascent territorial government, Twain describes the managerial structures of the Overland Stage Company in great detail. He also describes legal proceedings, the management of mines and mining speculation, and the workings of the government in Hawaii. He even satirizes Brigham Young's household by depicting a managerial structure in which wives and children are assigned numbers rather than names. Almost as much as Twain describes the peculiar individuals who make up the material of his anecdotes, he also persistently describes institutions like courts, legislatures, and corporations. Because much of Twain's work as a journalist in Nevada involved covering the proceedings of the territorial legislature, it's possible to attribute this focus to the particularities of his experiences as a journalist. Nevertheless, it is important to note the historical prevalence of bureaucratic management in the 19th century West. The West became one of the most heavily administrated regions within the United States by the end of the century. And in the 1860s, there were already the beginnings of unprecedented land and resource management across Western territories. Tracing what he calls the, quote, bureaucratic revolution in the West, the historian Richard White notes that, quote, although the popular image of the West was and remains one of scattered populations in isolation, the West, in fact, very quickly became an urban region whose cities held sway over vast hinterlands. By 1880, the West had become the most urbanized region in the country, end quote. Twain's descriptions of corporate bureaucracies, legal proceedings, and legislative wranglings are not so much a peculiar interest as they are an indication of what White calls a bureaucratic revolution that was already in its nascent stages. Twain's interest in emergent institutions can also be found in later works like A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a novel centered on the problem of building an administrative bureaucracy. As I've argued elsewhere, many popular depictions of the West, like the ones we find in the emergent genre of the Western, can also be understood as exploration of the limits of administrative discretion, rather than as explorations of lawlessness or extra-legal violence. Slade, the efficient servant of the overland, who was also an outlaw among outlaws, might serve as a useful example from Roughing It. Given that emergent institutions are, at the very least, a minor theme in Roughing It, one might then ask if there's an account of corruption in this work, and if so, what is the form that it takes in Mark Twain's West? In Twain's descriptions of the Nevada territorial government, there is no political graft in the usual sense of that term. There's no buying and selling of votes, and no theft from public funds. The members of the legislature are at times figured as comically inept, but they are not criminals engaging in quid pro quo exchanges of influence for money. Twain does complain that the federal government in Washington, quote, fondles artistic villainy, but the complaint highlights the honest, though unconventional, accounting of the territorial government. In fact, rather than criminal corruption, what we find in Roughing It is a government that is faulted for its speculative excesses. The legislature, quote, levied taxes to the amount of $30,000 or $40,000 and ordered expenditures to the extent of about $1 million. It passes so many toll road franchises that, quote, it was estimated that every citizen owned about 3 franchises, and it was believed that unless Congress gave the territory another degree of longitude, there would not be room enough to accommodate all the toll roads. There is a future-oriented optimism in the workings of the government. This becomes the object of Twain's satire and later becomes a central theme in the depiction of government corruption in the Gilded Age. There's, of course, nothing necessarily corrupt about such optimism, but it needs to be considered within the context of the silver and gold boom that Twain details through large swaths of Roughing It. If the government is only a minor theme in the work, the speculative excesses of the silver boom play a much more central role. Twain sought his fortune in the West and participated in the boom and bust cycles of mining speculation. He prospected for gold, pocket mined, established mining claims, and even briefly worked for an ore mill. Roughing It describes the ins and outs of mining in great technical detail, but just as often focuses on the buying and selling of mining stocks. As his letters from the period attest, Twain primarily sought his fortune through speculation rather than through the more strenuous activity of working mining claims. It was a, quote, beggar's revel, he writes in Roughing It, but one with, quote, no mining, no milling, no productive effort, no income, and not enough money in the entire camp to buy a corner lot in an eastern village. Immediately following this description of this beggar's revel, Twain turns to practices supporting this future-oriented speculative bubble, and it is here that one finds something akin to corruption in the usual sense of that term. Driving the speculative bubble are practices that falsely overstate the value of mines. As Twain details, miners assay unrepresentative samples to prop up the value of their stocks, and assayers prop up values to attract more business. These are acts that border on being criminal, but that are not quid pro quo exchanges. They are acts of misrepresentation or the misapplication of expertise that defraud investors, acts that damage the future-oriented act of prediction. Though the government is depicted through the lens of speculation in Roughing It, corruption remains in the realm of private market speculation. It would be a couple years later, when Twain and Warner published The Gilded Age, that he would bring together the workings of government and these speculative forms of corruption. The Gilded Age is set both in the nation's capital and in the American West, is a tale about corruption and land speculation. There are certainly examples of criminal graft in the novel, quid pro quo exchanges of money for political favors, and even the misappropriation of government funds. But the major plot lines of the novel consist in propping up land values through misrepresentation. In many cases, these misrepresentations are given weight by the expert declarations of engineers, whose expertise becomes a focus of the novel's satire. Take, for example, Henry, the wealthy Yale graduate who poses as an engineer rather than actually having the skills of one. Surveying land for the railroad in order to invest in land, he participates in a speculative system that uses the government to prop up the values of land artificially. Colonel Sellers provides another example, and one who would reappear in later works by Twain, like The American Claimant, and a number of his dramatic works. In all of these works, Sellers is depicted as a well-meaning fool whose speculative optimism is only superseded by his ignorance. He claims to be, quote, better read up in most sciences maybe than the general run of professional men, but is also an inventor of patent medicines who claims that candlelight can cure rheumatism. Henry and Sellers are not criminals, or even necessarily immoral in the logic of the novel. The novel depicts them as well-intentioned, but their centrality to their narrative is precisely what makes this novel so relevant to recent attempts to redefine corruption in ways that expand it beyond the very narrow confines that the Roberts Court has delineated over the past decade. Take, for example, recent work by legal scholar and activist Lawrence Lessig, whose 2011 monograph, Republic Lost, outlines forms of corruption that come, quote, not from the hidden bribery of the Gilded Age when cash was secreted among members of Congress to buy privilege and secure wealth. Lessig refers to the era rather than the novel, but while Twain's novel does contain a few examples of such bribery, the larger terms delineate what Lessig argues is an even greater threat to the Republic, the threat of people, quote, whose power comes not from hard work, creativity, innovation, or the creation of wealth, but who instead, quote, secure their wealth through manipulation of government and politicians. Henry Sellers, and a number of other characters in the novel manipulate the government as a speculative and future-oriented enterprise through these acts of misrepresentation by using expert knowledge for private gain or by leveraging expertise that is not grounded in actual knowledge or material conditions. These central characters are what Lessig describes as, quote, decent souls, who don't commit crimes but act with interests that are not public interests. Colonel Sellers is essentially a lobbyist trying to manipulate the government investment in land and infrastructure, and Henry is an engineer under contract to the government, but who also has private interests in the development of Western lands that are both pecuniary and personal. These characters don't commit quid pro quo crimes. Sellers doesn't pay bribes. He has no money after all. And Henry doesn't receive any. Instead, they try to manipulate how the government invests in our future. Following on the heels of Roughing It, The Gilded Age thus pulls together the speculative orientation of the Nevada legislature and the misrepresentations and misapplications of expertise that were rife in the business of mining. In doing so, it outlines a form of corruption that is far more pervasive in our contemporary politics than the very narrow quid pro quo that the Supreme Court has left us with. Thank you.